Well, historic day today with Donald Trump being arrested in New York, the first former president to face criminal charges. It has been a global spectacle. We're going to hear now from the former White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, does Trump have a criminal case to answer here or not?
Not really. I mean, technically, the answer is obviously yes. There's 34 felony charges against him, but they seem, even from the most even liberal commentators' perspective, to be very, very weak charges. These are charges that would ordinarily be misdemeanors. It's sort of a misdemeanor plus a misdemeanor might make a very low-level felony. So that while there are certainly criminal charges, I don't think anybody's seriously concerned about Donald Trump going to jail after these indictments were released today.
What did you make of Trump's speech in response to these historic charges today?
Yeah, I thought the speech was very flat. I was expecting something high energy. I was on AM Agenda earlier today on Sky News and talked about how jubilant I thought the airplane ride home might be from New York City to Mar-a-Lago. That the charges were so weak that you could not help, if you were a Trump supporter, to be enthusiastic about how the day had gone so far. And I thought the speech tonight would be high energy, would reflect sort of that optimism that came from a better than expected indictment today. And the speech was very flat. It could only be described as low energy. The president read almost entirely from the script. He was on the teleprompter the entire night. The president almost never does that. Former president almost never does that. And it was clear that he was tired. He was beaten by the day, perhaps. His family was not all present. His two sons were there. One of his daughters were there, but Ivanka was not. And his wife, Melania, and son, Barron, were not there either. So it was a very unusual setting for the speech that I think fell flat and did not help him politically.
And Mick, what does the flat nature of Trump's speech say about his mindset, knowing him as you do?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sharri. And I got to think it has to do with perhaps he was just worn out by the day. Perhaps really, despite all of his bluster and all of his, putting forth a good face, he was really concerned about this today and was really disturbed by the fact that he was being arrested, that he, Donald Trump, former president of the United States, was being fingerprinted. Of course, he did take a mugshot. He was not handcuffed today, but he was taken into custody. He was arrested, technically. He was fingerprinted, and he was charged with 34 felonies. And I sort of got the impression watching that speech that wore on him more than I expected, and that it simply sucked the life out of him today, and he had nothing to give during this speech this evening.
Ultimately, do you think that this case and the fact that there are 3 other cases, 2 of them criminal, 1 civil, that are being pursued here against Trump, do you think this is going to help him win the Republican primary?
Well, I think it's absolutely going to help him win the Republican primary. He's sucking all of the air out of the room. It's going to be Trump, Trump, Trump nonstop for the next several months. Keep in mind, the next hearing in this criminal indictment is not scheduled now until December. So there'll be, several months to sort of talk about what might happen at that hearing. And if you add on top of that additional criminal or civil charges, it's simply going to increase the amount of news media coverage that Donald Trump gets. And I think that helps lock up the Republican primary nomination. I don't think necessarily it helps him win the general election. People can still look at him and say, I like the policies, but boy, I really don't like the baggage. And I really don't like the idea of voting for a guy who might have been criminally charged or even possibly convicted between now and November of 2024. So I think it moves the needle a little bit in his favor on the Republican primary. I doubt very seriously that it moves the needle very much when it comes to running against a Democrat in 2024.
Mick, I'm not sure what your relationship is currently like with the former president, but do you know which case he's the most worried about of the 4 that he's being investigated for?
I don't have a close relationship with the president anymore. We had a falling out over January 6th. I quit my job in the administration the night of January 6th, so I've not talked to him since then. But I get a sense from talking to folks who are still around him in that inner circle in Mar-a-Lago, and from knowing what I know about him generally, I don't think this case in New York worries him in terms of going to jail. I think the one in Georgia probably worries him the most because it is a state charge, which means that a future Republican president could not pardon him. A president can only pardon people from federal crimes, not from state crimes. And they've got really hard evidence. They have voice recordings. Keep in mind, the evidence today introduced, or at least hinted at in New York, are nothing more than invoices and checks and ledger entries, pretty boring stuff. In Georgia, they have the President of the United States on tape saying, can you find me thus and such many votes? That's fairly damning testimony. And I think that case, probably more than the other ones, concerns Donald Trump.
Looking at the details of the indictment outlined by Alvin Bragg, hush money is not illegal, and Donald Trump paid for this out of his own finances. So what is the criminal element here?
The criminal element seems to be, Sharri, that it actually wasn't paid out of his pocket. It was paid out of one of his businesses. I believe it was one of the Trump family trust organizations, and that they booked that as legal expenses. And I believe, although I'm not sure about this, they may have taken it as a business deduction. But either way, if you book a hush money payment as something like legal expenses, that's a misreporting of those expenses. And that, under New York law, is a misdemeanor. If you put that together with doing it with the intent of committing another crime, it becomes a Class E, or a very low-level felony. And Alvin Bragg is taking the position that Trump misreported this as legal expenses in order to gain an advantage in his 2016 presidential campaign, which Bragg contends would be a campaign finance violation, probably also another misdemeanor. That's where we get to that misdemeanor plus misdemeanor equals felony sort of formula. So there must be something else. And of course, then when the indictment was unveiled today, there wasn't anything else. There's no new evidence. There's no new witnesses. There's no new nothing. It's just this very tenuous sort of claim to try and create a felony where only misdemeanors seem to exist at first glance.
So it does seem to be a political witch hunt.
Certainly when you combine the facts that we've discussed, the facts that are in the indictment, with the fact that Alvin Bragg ran for office. Keep in mind, the district attorney in Manhattan is an elected position in the state system in New York State. When he ran saying essentially, vote for me and I'll indict Donald Trump. I know Donald Trump. I've sued his family 100 times. Vote for me and I will give you his head on a platter. When you marry those two things together, then you cannot help but raise the question as to whether or not there wasn't at least some political motivation here.